Hello and welcome to another Wrestling Roundtable Discussion podcast. I'm Adam Wilbourn from WhatCulture, joined by the Dudley boys of WhatCulture, Michael Hamflett and Michael Sidgwick, to discuss another burning wrestling issue. But before we get into it, if you're a fan of this sort of thing, make sure you subscribe to WhatCulture Wrestling on either iTunes or Spotify for daily wrestling podcasts where we review Raw, SmackDown, pay-per-views, we have interviews, more roundtable discussions like this, and a roundup of the week complete with a bloody good quiz, of course, on WrestleCulture. But gents, I was browsing Reddit Squared Circle earlier on today. And,
thoughts and prayers.
Yes. And I saw a really good question that I thought we could answer today, which is, what wrestling feud made you think that the wrestlers actually hated each other?
Oh, you don't get enough of it nowadays. Like, wrestling history's laden with this sort of stuff. But before I delve too far into the past, for me, the best modern example of this, it's like happening as we speak. It's Becky Lynch versus Charlotte Flair. Like, the animosity in their last man standing match at Evolution was like palpable. It was one of those magic matches where I genuinely believe they actually hate each other. There was a big sort of punching, like, bombs sequence in the crowd, like, as the end of the third phase of the match. I just thought, I was completely spellbound. They were absolutely beating the piss out of each other. And one moment, my favourite moment from the TLC match that followed like a few months later, wasn't any of the big bumps, even though there were several like impressive jaw-dropper moments like you'd expect from such a match. But it arrived when Charlotte, to set up one of those bumps, draped Becky Lynch over a table. And it's one of those things, ordinarily, when you watch that sort of match, you don't want to pay too much attention to it because you know it's like a very wrestling thing to do that isn't really believable. Like, you're getting like gently
it's corporation that you don't want to think about.
Yeah, getting like gently positioned onto a table. Like, you can sell the dead cell and it doesn't really work. But Charlotte Flair not only filled up that plot hole, but she also like underscored the dynamic by just slapping her
Favorite bit of the match.
Full force in the face. It was absolutely magical. And I think the reason why they are so prepared and willing to lay into each other is because they are really, really close. Backstage in real life, like, they credit each other with propping one another up when things weren't going quite well for the other and vice versa. They were each other's rocks, and now they just beat the piss out of each other to make you believe they hate each other, and it's just wonderful stuff.
Well, if you need any further example of that, you may have seen the photo that did the rounds on the internet of Charlotte's arm following Elimination Chamber.
The largest arm.
Indeed. Oh. Michael Hamflett, what's one of these feuds for you?
Well, a few Triple H feuds came to mind, but he gets enough attention, so I'll come back to him later if that's okay.
Okay, I was going to mention him as well.
I'm going to go another recent one, slightly further back in the women's division, because I happen to be writing a piece, cheap plug, on the 4-year anniversary.
We're getting dangerously close to getting cold cooks here.
Yeah.
Starting with two women.
Don't worry, I'll pull it back.
It's sort of like, this like goes back to the doldrums of the Divas division, because I was thinking about like how it's just coming up on 4 years since that infamous Bella Twins, Paige and Emma match that kind of changed everything, if you want to believe WWE's narrative. And it got me thinking about the Bellas and AJ Lee. The matches, for what they were, I wouldn't say ahead of the time, but like Nikki Bella was evolving into something beyond what we'd ever seen out of either her or her sister. AJ Lee's work, whilst not always perfect, was strong for the time. But it always makes me think of, the internet called it a pipe bomb. I don't think I like that, because I think it classifies AJ Lee's promo as a sequel to CM Punk's, and it shouldn't be.
Would they have called it that if they weren't together either?
Exactly, yeah. Like, she shouldn't be defined by who she was dating, which I think is how that name came to be. But AJ Lee's sort of addressing of the Divas division as it was at the time, which was mainly a vehicle for this new E-show, Total Divas, you can hear the Bellas trying to heckle AJ Lee from the ring as she stands atop the ramp with a microphone in her hand. The pettiness required for Brie and Nikki to shout and holler at AJ Lee holding a microphone as she comes up with some fairly reasoned criticisms of the division and what she was trying to achieve, in contrast to what they were trying to achieve out of their respective careers at the time. It was magic to watch, and then it made all their conflicts so believable. Every time you saw, especially I think Brie would run interference to Nikki Bella on the floor, and say AJ Lee would roll to the floor and Nikki would stick the boots in. And I'm not trying to relate this to what we saw last year as how hard she likes to kick, but it looked like she was really laying it in on AJ Lee. It felt as though these were two, well, they were philosophically opposed to one another, and then they're out there in the ring doing things differently and doing things the way that they believed was best, and you just sort of, you felt the philosophical difference between the two, even when they were only getting given, 5 minutes on a pay-per-view if they were lucky. I don't know if that was just me buying into the narrative at the time, but I was very much willing to believe that before they've gone out of the ring, there's that little bit of competitive spark in Gorilla that gets taken away from you when you watch a WWE Network special now. When you see them get backstage and you see them hug and high five and say, yeah, job well done, it's great to see colleagues supporting one another. It really is. But there's also that little bit of you that wants to believe that there's that competitive rage and that competitive jealousy that sparks what we're seeing when they go out there and pretend to fight.
I feel like we are contractually obliged to mention the Summer of Punk in this context, because John Cena is not someone who I'd pick for the genuinely believable feud, because CM Punk openly admitted he didn't dislike John Cena. He liked him a lot more than he liked a few people in the back. So I'm going to pick his infamous feud and promos alongside Paul Levesque, aka Triple H. This is Phil Brooks talking to Paul Levesque. For me, then I know I may have been swept up in it all at the time, but even going back and looking at some of those old promos, you can sense the animosity. The skinny fat ass comment is something that we always come back to. But
an all-time favourite.
It's something that carries a lot of weight for me with Triple H.
That, like CM Punk round the middle.
He saved that. He wouldn't have just used that on anyone. You could tell that was something he'd probably been saying behind his back for quite a few years in WWE. I mean, it helped me really buy into that feud, which, granted, muddied the waters of the Summer of Punk hugely, as we've discussed on many other videos. But yeah, the promos, the back and forth between the two of them, and it's not just the way that Triple H talked to CM Punk, but also the way the CM Punk responded to him. He was the sort of breaking of kayfabe and all that came with that. You can tell it was done to slightly irk Triple H as well. It was
the hatred and the animosity, I agree, was completely palpable, because Wrestling Apocrypha has it that upon doing a tryout match for WWE, CM Punk was judged to have not been able to work, and the person who gave that appraisal was Triple H alongside Shawn Michaels and Gorilla, and various WWE personnel have come out and claimed like this is actually true, this happened. I don't know if it's defensiveness or if you get into the bubble and the way of doing a certain thing, which WWE economically has mastered for years and years and years at that point, then you're probably going to think anything that's vaguely indie-rific is like an affront to the way of doing things.
Especially then.
Especially then. Like, even now, when they've like reluctantly embraced that whole like talent pool, but like especially then, they've probably seen him do like his martial arts influenced stuff and his sort of like submission transitions, which you never really saw in WWE. Kurt Angle, man, again. Imagine having to say that every single Monday night. Jesus Christ! But yeah, you just never saw it in that company at the time, and CM Punk, rather, as we know, had a gigantic chip on his shoulder. And what made it worse is that that chip was weighing him down at the exact same time. In his mind, he thought he was going to be ascending above all of this. So as all of these really tense interactions were going on, CM Punk was probably thinking, this is falling away from me. This is falling away from me, and it is your fault. Just because I mentioned your name in a promo, you absolute mark. So all of this sentiment was just palpable on the surface. And realistically, those segments remain fascinating, even though the creative was atrocious, like mind-bogglingly counterproductive. You can still go back and watch those interactions and get a little bit of fascination out of them. So the Summer of Punk didn't, for me, end at Money in the Bank, because, albeit briefly, like that, they're fascinating.
I actually had that one on my list as well, because I'm the same as Sidgwick. I can go back and watch those promos, even though I think they kind of ruin pro wrestling as an art form of what it's supposed to be. You can't watch it and try and keep your wrestling head switched on, because it's a mess. It's an absolute mess. The things that they're saying to each other don't marry up with their characters. They don't marry up with a work or a shoot. It's all over the shop. There's a couple of things that always stick out. I know this is not ideal for those listening rather than those in the visual medium, but there's a GIF that if you're often looking on Twitter for GIFs of Triple H pursing his lips, and it's a particularly smug face.
I always look for that.
Well, like it's a smug face that he pulls when CM Punk said something or other. I can't recall the exact promo. And it's the face that says, whatever you've just said there, I'm still the boss here, and I'm going to ruin you next week for this, or I'm going to ruin you next month, or for the rest of this year, and then he proceeds to go and do it. There's another one where CM Punk has obviously got to follow a certain set of bullet points to stop something going off the rails, and he pulls Triple H's tie out of his suit and prods him in the face like he's teasing a toddler or something like that. And I'd sensed, even watching it now, because I watched it before this podcast, I sensed even then that it was just, well, nothing in this script is going to get me over as much as the thing that I'm going to do. And I'm going to dare you to do something about it. And he can't. What's he going to do? Is he going to swing for him? Are they going to have to like improvise a bit of a work back and forth?
Who would win in a shoot fight between Triple H and CM Punk?
I don't know, because I don't know if... Well, I've seen CM Punk fight for real,
Yeah,
so I don't know the answer. But it was those moments, those little passive-aggressive moments between the two. My man Kevin Nash stood having to watch the two of them fight over his affection almost. it was my like fantasy booking wet dream. But yeah, there's a tension to that. The problem is, of course, and we've talked about this when we've talked about works and shoots before, it is counterproductive commercially speaking. That does nothing for nobody. One of the CM Punk's, as angry as he was in that infamous Colt Cabana podcast and all those things that triggered lawsuits and huge things that were alleged, you could tell it still really bothered him that he got pinned against Triple H on a pay-per-view. That's just pro wrestling, mate. Yeah. That's the stuff you need to let go. And he was angry to that day about having to like lay down and take that pin because he could never ever reconcile in his head what the logic behind that was. And it's like, mate, you're trapped in this storyline. There are bigger fish to fry than laying down for Triple H because everybody's done it.
CM Punk was a name that immediately popped in my head when we first started discussing this. The Triple H stuff, of course. I sense there was a few other people backstage he probably irked. But also, I did want to quickly mention the CM Punk Jeff Hardy angle because that married so perfectly with what they were like outside the ring.
Yes, absolutely. One of my all-time favourite storylines, this, because I was such a massive CM Punk fan. I knew exactly how well he would flourish in the heel role in WWE. And as you say, in Jeff Hardy, they had the absolute perfect platform to resuscitate the better than you, holier than thou, straight edge gimmick. They crafted the storyline beat for beat across television and pay-per-view so wonderfully, and it caught so many real notes. CM Punk was not floundering as a babyface, but if I recall correctly, it was a big swing amongst the crowd to see Christian win Money in the Bank as opposed to CM Punk for a second time. Meanwhile, Jeff Hardy, like evergreen in popularity, he was always...
We believed him to be a reformed character at the time as well. The WWE were masking that he still had quite a lot of serious addiction problems.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
You were with it.
So Jeff Hardy at the time was also not significantly, but like he was very much more popular than CM Punk, which obviously would have really, really annoyed him. Really annoyed him. And again, it's just that philosophical difference of CM Punk, who's so steadfast in his refusal to live a life of excess because he deems himself above it, versus a person with... And this, again, it's just, there's yet another layer to it. Jeff Hardy, I'm not saying he's a better pro wrestler than CM Punk, but I don't know, things just seem to come more natural to him. Like he had
certainly more rounded sports entertainer. He feels like a bigger star sometimes within WWE. Pre-pipe bomb CM Punk.
See, I don't know about this,
but again,
I can imagine that Jeff Hardy's just got an inherent star power and magnetism that CM Punk kind of had to work for and to create, no, like pun intended, a cult of personality around himself. He worked deeply, deeply hard at something to which came naturally to Jeff Hardy. So there's all these dynamics at play. And CM Punk, not only were all these dynamics at play, he had a motivation at this point to be a top guy. So with all of these different factors converging into this wonderful, well-crafted storyline, it was just, for me, like a platonic ideal of pro wrestling. I absolutely loved it and believed every single second of it.
I want to go back to the Attitude Era, if I'm allowed. What about the Attitude Era? What about those days when every wrestler was competing with every other wrestler for every spot on the card? It's the reason Steve Austin would have the likes of Dean Ambrose on his podcast and be furious that Ambrose could be so laid back with the WWE title over his shoulder. And I think about those promos of the guys underneath Austin that were desperate to get to that next level. And we're back to Triple H again, but it's more because we can reminisce about him getting bantered off by The Rock. They were sent out there and they were given all this time because they were the two top stars, especially when Austin went down with a neck injury in 2000, and the two of them were relied upon to carry the company, and they were, with their incredible matches. Triple H was probably the best all-rounder in the world, but The Rock was The Rock, becoming the mainstream breakout star probably of all time. And they were both getting given time, ample time. Triple H was never the best at using that. Triple H was, if he saw 20 minutes, he wasn't going to maximize those minutes. He was just going to stretch them out and make them feel even longer. And he would come out there and he would say, I'm the best, I'm the game, blah, 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 blah. The Rock would come out and as Austin would say, spin his nursery rhymes. And then Triple H would have no comebacks for these because it's The Rock. Nobody has a comeback for The Rock. So he would just kind of go into shoot mode a little bit. He's like, yeah, good one, Rocker. Like that. And he was like, that's just off script. You've got nothing for him. You've got absolutely nothing for him. But like, I even think back to the 1998 SummerSlam ladder match they had, which was a vehicle designed to get Triple H over, and The Rock, in defeat, came out like looking like a bigger star. Madison Square Garden had basically anointed The Rock as the next WWE champion after Stone Cold Steve Austin. So then you'd have DX coming out and Triple H was the babyface, so he was allowed to get one over, and he would just resort to knob gags. That was all he had left in his locker because The Rock was all of a sudden this massive, massive star. And, you know, we were talking about this before we even went on air because we still talk about wrestling even when that camera's not on. We were just talking about, like, it's one of mine and Michael Sidgwick's favourite things to do. It's to just stumble across a time when Triple H is burying Randy Orton. His career of insecurity, when he should be the most secure man in the industry, makes you believe that he loathes half of the people he has to work with just because he has to cut them down. And The Rock was the Rock was the oak tree that he could never even leave a little sort of dent in, and it was just great watching him try. Like, I can't get enough of watching him try and fail to bring someone like The Rock to his knees.
Yeah, for me, I'm going to just do it very briefly because I know there's a great deal of the WhatCulture audience who isn't au fait with or particularly interested in the All Japan Pro Wrestling scene of the 1990s, but I will touch upon this very briefly just as a plea to watch a classic pro wrestling match, and it might even enrich your fandom, your hobby of choice. Mitsuru Misawa and Toshiaki Kawada have got one of the most intriguing dynamics in pro wrestling of all time because it was all informed by reality. They shared 2 All Japan and they went to the same high school. And Misawa was always in amateur wrestling, and the way he got to All Japan Pro Wrestling, the opportunities that were handed to him, like one step ahead. And in the meantime, Kawada he's kind of like the hipster's choice as the better worker, but Misawa was the office choice for who was going to get chosen. It was a great one because he was an absolute genius in the ring and a massive draw. And adding to this dynamic, Kawada was the man to first remove the tiger mask, the literal tiger mask from Misawa, and in removing the mask from Misawa, it became an overnight sensation, and Kawada basically like nailed the final coffin in his career as the ace of All Japan Pro Wrestling. They then, having turned from tag team partners into rivals, entered into a feud with one another, which was so intricately booked to lead to a match between them in June of 1994, which is an all-time classic. And just basically, it's a plea. Go and find that match. Misawa, Kawada, 1994. It's on YouTube. It is absolutely unreal. And Kawada is one of the greatest heels of all time because he's just such a good prick. He's such a good, violent prick who revels in doing prick things. And in the opposite corner is the guy he demonstrably, palpably, visibly hates the most, and it's just great, great, great stuff. So go and watch that if you've got a spare 40 minutes.
To use that as a sort of jumping off point as we wrap up here, is it fair to say that sometimes the people who are former teammates and certainly are definitely friends outside the ring, because, like we mentioned at the start of this, because they can lay into each other so strong, does that almost help you suspend your disbelief? I'm talking about like a DIY or a Steen and Generico or Owens and Zayn, as they obviously became in WWE. Is that part of the reason why?
It's just chemistry.
Yeah.
As you say, it's all about chemistry, and whichever side the relationship lies, whether they're really close or they despise each other, funnily enough, being wrestling, the opposite of everything, the closer you are, the better you are at creating the illusion of hatred. If 2 people hate each other in real life, they're going to be less inclined to cooperate with each other. And that's not to say they're going to shoot on each other, but I always go back to Bret Hart versus Shawn Michaels.
Exactly,
like, they never, for me, produced like real hatred in the ring. I know the obvious exception is the 1997 Survivor Series match. That brawl is absolutely electric, but they only got it at the very end. Like, I know it was a babyface versus babyface match at WrestleMania 12, but it just felt ugly, uncoordinated, but not in like a good way. it just didn't really work.
Neither of them liked each other enough to give enough of
Yes,
themselves.
that's the way
to the
yeah.
job. These were the guys, you know, like with Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels in the 90s especially, like the 1997, if you could catch them both at exactly the right time, almost perfect pro wrestlers, so that giving to anybody else, they could give somebody the match of their lives, and they didn't want to give it to each other. And that selfishness, that rank selfishness that underpinned all the matches, effectively ruined them all just a little bit. Even the Iron Man match, Bret Hart would call that his favourite in terms of what an athletic endeavour. But they're both very selfish.
We
in the
know
match, and you
why
can see
Bret
it
Hart rates that as his favourite match. We know why he does, because he
Yeah.
timed it to the very
Yeah.
second, and it was a big achievement on his own part. He's had way better matches.
We'd be remiss before we finish up here to not mention HBK versus Y2J, though, because that was another one that really popped in my mind. You know, the classic WrestleMania moment where they embrace and then Jericho kicks him. And then, of course, when Jericho sort of reinvented himself in the late noughties, that was a really thrilling feud for me. You know, Jericho punching HBK's wife, the eye thing, Jericho, what's it called? Jeritron 5000. All of that, obviously we talked about it on previous podcasts, the fact that HBK's feud with The Undertaker got him so much that he effectively handed the World Heavyweight Championship to such a huge rival of his. All the body of work there for me.
It's like, I think what I like about that feud, even now, is that wrestlers, when given the trust to craft an epic, can do it together. Probably better than their bosses, probably better than Vince McMahon, and probably Triple H. Shawn and Jericho had to fight to get that feud to last longer than one pay-per-view. And by the time it's come to an end, the world title's been put into it because it has to be, because it's the main program, it's the main concern of the entire organization. And that was supposed to last one pay-per-view. After that attack, after he went into the screen, Michaels was supposed to sell the eye injury, and that was supposed to be it. And then we find ourselves in the summer, Shawn Michaels' wife is getting punched. That's two wrestlers who have got the confidence to be able to take control of their careers. And I think probably a modern comparison for that now would be something like Ambrose and Rollins. There were two men being told what to do, being dictated how their storyline played out. And we didn't get what should have been a feud that was full of hatred, because we've been given the story countless times.
And we'd seen it before. When the roles were reversed, it worked perfect.
I really love that stuff in 2014.
There was a story that's been told very well in the past, and what we got instead was the worst bastardized version of it, that the company's hands were all over it, and you just wish that those two maybe would have fought for themselves a little bit more, so that we could see yet more of that hatred, because it just wasn't there.
One last thing before we sign off. Again, another match recommendation. If you're really interested in watching two pro wrestlers who just eminently despise one another, you need to go and watch Starrcade 1985 to watch the match between Magnum TA and Tully Blanchard. It's a very underrated component of this match, which you never really, I was going to say see, but you never literally hear anymore. The anguished howls and the screams and the rage. It's like an oral horror of a match, particularly during the finish, when Magnum has got a sort of chair leg and he's about to poke someone's eye out. Like the squeals, the anguish, the horror. It's just great pro wrestling. So if you want hatred, you have to watch that match.
Well, let us know your thoughts on some of the best feuds that made you genuinely think that the wrestlers hated each other in the comments section below, or on Twitter at WhatCultureWWE. Quick caveat, Matt Hardy versus Edge doesn't count, for obvious reasons.
I hate you, Adam.
Really, really obvious that. Anyway, but let us know your thoughts, yes, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And you can follow us all on Twitter. Actually, you can follow Michael Hamflett at
Michael Hamflett.
You can follow Michael Sidgwick at
Sidgwick.
You can follow me at Adam Wilbourn. I said you can follow us all at WhatCultureWWE, and make sure you subscribe to What Culture Wrestling on either iTunes or Spotify for daily wrestling podcasts. My thanks to the Dudley Boys. Thank you for watching, and we will see you soon.